So I want to do something a little different with this video. I just saw Ridley Scott's film Napoleon, and I just want to do a quick extemporaneous review of the film. I just want to share my thoughts. I just want to give my general impressions and feelings. I don't have notes. I don't have a thesis statement. I don't have some broad overarching theory of the film. I just want to talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, just a general, as I said, review. Okay, so first of all, let me just say there are inevitably going to be spoilers in this review. Since I'm not operating off of a script, and since I'm just kind of going to dump my stream of consciousness thoughts on the film out there, I'm not going to be able to take special care to avoid spoiling anything. Not that I'm particularly worried about spoiling the major plot points of a film that's about the life of one of history's most important figures. I'm not really scared that anyone's going to walk away from this video and be like, he spoiled the life of Napoleon for me. I didn't know what happened at Waterloo. But that said, the techniques that Ridley Scott uses, the way he frames the film, his approach to telling the story, are all things that can be spoiled too. Okay, I've procrastinated enough. Let's talk about the movie. So, the thing that really struck me about the film, and perhaps the thing I admire most about it, is its sheer audacity. Listen, this is not at all the Napoleon film I expected going into the theater. And it's probably not at all the movie that your imagination conjures up if someone told you that Ridley Scott made a film about the life of Napoleon. I mean, what are you imagining if I say that? You're probably thinking about large-scale battle sequences, which are in the film, right? But you're probably thinking this is going to be a biopic that really focuses in on Napoleon as a military tactician, that really focuses on his strategic genius, and that really goes out of its way to stage these incredibly complex and sophisticated and beautiful battle scenes, you know, with a great emphasis on action and the carnage of war and all of that. And there's, as I said, there's some of the latter in there. There are a few battles in this film, although certainly less than you would expect given its runtime of 2.5 hours. But that's not really the film that Ridley Scott chose to make. Instead, this is really a black comedy, a very dark comedy with a lot of social awkwardness in it, and with a surprising amount of focus on the relationship between Napoleon and his wife and empress, Josephine. And also a movie that, rather than portraying Napoleon as a genius and as one of history's great men, kind of makes him look like a little bit of a buffoon, and certainly a narcissist, and certainly someone with a real strain of social awkwardness, and really someone who you walk away from the film with an odd mix of contempt and pity for. And listen, I understand that is not the film about Napoleon that a lot of people are going to go to the theaters hoping to see. And in fact, I've already seen like some negative discourse about the film online, some disappointment about its historical inaccuracy, which I'm not really fit to comment on, and which I don't really care a lot about, but also just general backlash to the approach that the film takes. And yeah, I get it. If you were hoping to see the film that I described earlier, and even like the film that kind of the trailers make you want to believe Napoleon is, then yeah, you're going to walk away disappointed. But I have a real deep admiration for Ridley Scott's refusal to make that film. Because listen, we live in an age where movies are unbelievably fucking expensive to make, where studios are very unwilling to take risks, unwilling to take gambles, and where directors are often aggressively pigeonholed into either making the kind of film the studios want them to make, you know, another big budget superhero movie or something like that, right? Or if not that, or at least aggressively pressured to make the kind of film that audiences expect them to make. And the expectation for Ridley Scott is that he's going to make a big budget action film. And on some level, he just decided not to do it. And instead, to make a profoundly, and I hate to use this term, but it's the one that pops into my head, a profoundly quirky movie about Napoleon, and one that's so much more about interpersonal awkwardness than it is about what happens on the battlefield, and so much more interested in the pathology of what happens in Napoleon's bedroom than it is in his skill as a political or military figure or commander. And that's fascinating to me. That's fascinating to me. And honestly, there's something thrilling just about sitting down and watching a movie and having it not at all be the movie you expected to see. And not only for that movie to not be the movie that you expected to be, but for it to be a really audacious and weird and surprising film. That's just oddly invigorating. It's just a weirdly pleasing experience to have in the cinema in this period, as I said, of real entrenchment of genres and styles and approaches and a real fear of risk taking. This is a tremendously risky film. This is a tremendously risky film that I kind of imagine might not make that much money at the box office, even though it did surprisingly well in its second weekend. But I could see word of mouth harming this film just because, like I said, not only is it a movie that doesn't meet audiences' expectations, but the trailers very much sold a different movie than the movie that audiences ultimately got when they sat down. So yeah, on that level, on the level of its sheer refusal to conform to the expectations of studios and audiences, I liked it. I loved it even. I loved that about it. But there is, of course, another question that I have to answer if I'm going to review the film, and that's, is it a good movie? Is this a successful film? Does this film actually creatively succeed? And I'm a little more on the fence about that, honestly. So let me talk first about what I liked about the film, because I really do want to foreground that, because like I said, I have a lot of admiration for what Ridley Scott is doing here. And one thing I liked above all else is the fact that you can tell that Ridley Scott had a very clear vision for what he was trying to do with this film. That he really very much wanted to make a black comedy about the life of Napoleon with a very keen focus on the pathology underlying Napoleon as a human being. I think he was very much intentionally trying to do a satirical critique of the great man theory of history. And I think he wanted to take someone who's widely seen as one of the greatest and most influential human beings to ever live and to really subvert our expectations and our perceptions of that person, to present them in a less than flattering light, a light that really focuses on their pathos and their insecurity and their social awkwardness and how they might have been perhaps a narcissist, how they might have even overestimated their own abilities. We may talk about whether or not history overestimated Napoleon, but here is a film that firmly believes that Napoleon overestimated himself. And I think whether you agree with that thesis or not, by sticking so closely to that idea, Ridley Scott has produced a film that's very cohesive, that holds together very well, and that has a clear and unequivocal vision. I also think the film really works as a comedy. This is a really funny film. And it's a film that finds its laughs in really unconventional ways. It's almost slapstick, really, in its approach. And I think the comedy in the film works in no small part due to Joaquin Phoenix's performance, which is just so profoundly awkward and uncomfortable. You really cannot predict how he's going to react in any given scene. And I've seen his performance criticized a little bit for this, and I think the people criticizing him kind of misunderstand what movie he's in. Because yes, his performance can seem a little stilted. There are a lot of times where he just sort of stares, where there are these long, uncomfortable pauses after another character speaks to him, or where he responds in a weird or awkward way. And yeah, if this was a serious period piece that was trying to evoke the gravitas of Napoleon, then that would be totally out of place. But this is a movie about social discomfort. This is a comedy about social discomfort and about the way that social discomfort bleeds into politics, and about how political discomfort can breed social discomfort and vice versa. And this is a movie, ultimately, about an awkward and pathological man. And so, within that context, Joaquin Phoenix's performance really works, I think. And in fact, I think as a director, Ridley Scott has made some really fascinating choices here that very much complement what Joaquin Phoenix is doing as an actor. There are moments that have been left in this film that feel almost like bloopers. There are scenes that go on just a little bit too long. There are exchanges where there'll be some verbal tick or some minor little thing that Joaquin Phoenix does in his performance, in his acting, in the way he moves, that feels almost like a gaffe. There's a moment with his hat, I believe, when he's talking to Josephine, where he very nearly drops the hat, or he picks up the hat and kind of fiddles with it, and he goes to put it on her head and on his head. And there are a number of moments like that in the scene that have this real feeling of almost unscriptedness. And they're often moments that intersect with Phoenix's performance as Napoleon. And I think those moments really work. First of all, because they're actually funny. They're funny because they're not at all what we expect from this sort of period piece. Usually historical dramas have a real sense of flatness to them, or if not flatness, a real sense of their own importance, right? And of the importance of these historical moments that they're portraying. And this film does everything possible to undermine Napoleon's importance, and especially his self-importance, his idea of himself, as I said earlier, as a great man. And so, since there's this real disconnect between what we're expecting to see on the screen and what actually happens, what can we fill that vacuum with? What can we fill that space between our expectations and reality with but laughter? So we just naturally laugh at something like that because it's so unexpected and so absurd. But even more than that, I think this sort of faux unscripted, gaffy, bloopery seeming approach to filmmaking fits thematically really well with what Ridley Scott is doing, and fits really well with the way that he's portraying this moment in history and the factors at play there. I think this film really wants us to focus on the chaos of this historical moment, on just the absolute unhinged, unpredictable absurdity of the French Revolutionary period and its aftermath. Instead of us seeing this as this moment of great drama and great tragedy and great men, I think he wants us to see a huge historical and political vacuum that's been created by the chaos and unpredictability of a moment of a real social breakdown, right? Social, political, military breakdown. You have this societal collapse, and rather than that being a thing that feels scripted, that feels like it's some grand drama, some great theatrical event, that actually in the moment, it's a mess. It's just wild and unpredictable. And that wild unpredictability creates an opening for people to improvise. And I think that Scott really wants us to see Napoleon as someone who is largely improvising his way to power, as opposed to someone who was just rigorously strategic. And one of my favorite moments in the film is when Napoleon is in the midst of executing this coup against the French Republican government, the coup that would ultimately lead to him being crowned as emperor. And there's this moment where the French politicians are basically refusing to pass a resolution, or whatever you want to call it, that would make Napoleon the de facto dictator of France. And the army is waiting outside to back him up, and he kind of scrambles out of the legislative chamber on his way to inform the military so they can move in and essentially execute the coup. And while he's on his way outside, he falls down the stairs. And the whole sequence really plays like slapstick. Instead of seeming like this meticulously executed coup, instead of seeming like this meticulously executed overthrow of the French government, it just seems like a mess. It just seems silly. And as I said, it just seems like slapstick. It seems more like something out of a screwball comedy than out of a film about this great strategic mastermind. And even in its opening sequence, the film does a wonderful job of undermining our expectations for a grand dramatic historical film, and instead presenting something far messier and far uglier and far more interesting. So the film opens with the execution of Marie Antoinette, and when she's being led up to the guillotine to be beheaded, you've got we have seen this moment in film so many times, in film and television. We've seen so many adaptations of this moment, and you're expecting something really dramatic and really tragic, and you're expecting that to be reflected in the way that the sequence is staged. But instead, even from minute one, like, the first thing I was drawn to was how unkempt her hair was, which is such a great subversion of the way Marie Antoinette is usually portrayed in film. She looks exactly as frazzled and messy as you would expect someone being led to their execution to look. And then when they get her to kneel down and place her head in the guillotine, the executioner struggles to slide down the little wooden panel that is going to lock her into place. And you see him fumble with it just for a few seconds, right? It's not something Ridley Scott goes out of his way to draw your attention to, but just that little bit of fumbling, just that little bit of difficulty locking the mechanism in place, lets us know what we're in for. Cues us in to anticipate a film where often things are not going to go exactly to plan. Encourages us to look for these moments that feel like gaffes, that feel almost like mistakes, that feel like, oh, maybe the director should have taken another take there. Because hidden in those moments, I think, is the essence of what Scott is trying to do with this film. Okay, so with all of that praise out of the way, why is it that I said before that I was conflicted about this film? Well, honestly, for as much as I admire the fact that Ridley Scott had such a clear and unequivocal vision for the movie, as much as I admire the fact that he obviously made exactly the movie that he wanted to make, and as much as I found a lot of the movie to be legitimately hilarious, including Joaquin Phoenix's performance, I have to say that the movie was perhaps a little too single-minded for my taste, maybe a little too unequivocal in its presentation of Napoleon as this clownish and buffoonish figure. Okay, so now it sounds like I'm contradicting myself, but let me explain. So, first of all, I'm not saying that I wanted a kind of hagiographic presentation of Napoleon. As I said before, I'm actually really down with the idea of presenting a very slapstick look at this moment in history. And I'm also very much down with this kind of blackly comic approach to a moment of great historical importance. And in fact, I absolutely love The Death of Stalin, which also took a very dark and very bleak and very important moment in history and turned it into a very dark comedy full of lots of social maneuvering and weird interpersonal awkwardness. But I don't think this film is quite as successful as that one. And I think this film is less successful in part because its devotion to showing Napoleon as a purely pathological figure prevents the film from becoming very nuanced and very sophisticated in its portrayal of the historical moment that it's trying to capture. Like, I really do think the film wants us to see Napoleon as an opportunist, as someone who was presented with this moment in history where he could rise in spite of his flaws, in spite of his limitations, in spite of his lack of social graces. But the Napoleon that the film gives us is so one-note and so boorish and so interpersonally inadequate that we really struggle to see how he could possibly have pulled any of this off. So instead of getting a portrait of a deeply flawed and perhaps mentally ill man who took advantage of a singularly chaotic moment in history to seize power, we get the portrait of a guy who seems to just get lucky again and again and again. It almost has like a Forrest Gumpy or Being There-esque feel to it, where Napoleon seems like such a buffoon that it's almost as if fate just keeps dealing him opportunities to succeed. And we do get a couple of moments where he acts in a strategically smart way, especially in the 4 or so relatively brief battle sequences that are in the film. But even there, there's a kind of unwillingness on Ridley Scott's part to really flesh out the details of how Napoleon is taking advantage of these situations. And I get the sense that Ridley Scott was so desperate not to portray Napoleon as an exemplary or a genius figure that he may have erred too far in the other direction, and that something a little bit more complicated, a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more nuanced in particular would have been a lot more successful. Similarly, I kind of feel like the way that Napoleon is pathological in the film could be a little more inventive. It's a very, very Freudian depiction of Napoleon. I mean, you outright have a moment where Napoleon flat out compares Josephine to his mother. So it's not subtle at all. The Freudian shit here is not at all subtle. And listen, I don't think that's an intrinsically wrong approach to take. I'm not someone who thinks that psychoanalysis is so inherently disreputable or evil or corrupt that it shouldn't be incorporated into films. No, I think that whether you think a Freudian approach to psychology is valid or not, it can still be an interesting lens to apply when you're studying a character, when you're doing a film that's fundamentally a look at a person who's mentally troubled. But it's such an easy approach to take with Napoleon. Because, come on, Napoleon complex is a term for a reason. It's not as if there's something wholly unique and surprising about looking at Napoleon through a psychoanalytic or Freudian lens. In fact, there's an argument to be made that that's just about the second easiest way to look at Napoleon after the great man thing, after the great general approach. And so that's another area where a little bit more inventiveness and a little bit more nuance would have been appreciated. I also feel like the battle sequences in the film are a little unfocused. It almost seems like there are moments where Ridley Scott is trying to offer us the Ridley Scott movie that we all kind of came to see, especially in the Battle of Waterloo that closes the film. That's a very protracted battle, and it does kind of lapse into that kind of spectacle. But ultimately, the battles in the movie just seemed kind of unfocused and muddy to me. I will say they are chaotic in parts, and I appreciate some of what Ridley Scott is doing here and how it emphasizes like the larger themes of this kind of social breakdown and social chaos. He definitely totally avoids making these battles seem heroic or highly synchronized or highly stylized. You get a really good sense of the chaos and disorganization of war. And you also get a really good sense at the like bloody toll of war. And in fact, the Battle of Austerlitz in this film is pretty interesting because this is sort of Napoleon's great strategic victory. This is his moment of most supreme triumph. And instead of fixating on the like meticulous movements of armies, on the execution of grand battle plans, a lot of that battle in this film is just images of men slipping under the ice, falling through the ice and drowning, just corpses falling into the frozen lake, just blood filling the water. And that decision to focus on the human toll makes sense with what he's doing elsewhere in the film. But overall, I kind of did feel my attention flagging a little bit once the battles kicked into gear. I will say I wasn't 100% on board with the film's pacing either. There are maybe a few too many scenes between Napoleon and Josephine, or more precisely, there are maybe a few too many scenes between them that are too much like scenes we've already seen between them. There are a lot of shared moments between Napoleon and Josephine that feel a little redundant, that feel like, oh, okay, we already understand that this couple have rather bizarre sexual dynamics. We understand that there's a kind of weird, sort of almost sadomasochistic undercurrent to this relationship, this weird power-sharing dynamic, and we get it. And so we get a lot of very similar scenes that don't enrich and build upon that dynamic. We don't get a sense that, oh, a little bit more is being revealed about the psychology of Napoleon or the psychology of Josephine or the intricacies of their relationship, weird as they may be, with each scene that passes. Instead, it kind of feels like a reset button is hit, and there is a lot of going over the same ground, even if some of those moments are very funny, and I can understand why there would have been a desire not to cut them. Okay, so I feel like I've been rambling for longer than I planned to. I feel like I need to wrap this thing up. So, holistically, at the end of the day, did I like Napoleon? Yeah, actually, I did. If I was going to give it a rating with like a generic critic scale, I would say this is kind of the archetypal 3 out of 5 star movie. Meaning it's a good film. It's a good film. It's a good film with a clear idea of what it wants to accomplish. But it doesn't quite accomplish what it wants to accomplish. Or it could have accomplished what it hoped to accomplish in a more nuanced and interesting way. I feel like that was just about the most labored and pretentious way to put it. But you get what I'm saying. It doesn't quite work, but it works more than enough for me to recommend seeing it. Especially in this moment, especially right now, when we're seeing this kind of dual trend of this resurgence of actual author-driven or actual director-driven cinema with films like Oppenheimer and Napoleon and Killers of the Flower Moon. And yet, yes, even on some weird level with films like Barbie, right? And we're also finally seeing a decline in the endless bloat of like mechanically processed superhero films and the kind of endless IP zombie films that Disney and company have been pumping out. So in this moment, I say, yeah, absolutely. If there's an interesting film out there, and Napoleon is absolutely an interesting film, you should go see it. So yeah, go see Napoleon. I guess that's it. I guess I'm done. All right. Hello, Mr. Bones. You want to be a part of the video, Mr. Bones, huh? Yeah? Okay, here. Come here. Come here. Oh. I love you, buddy. You gonna be quiet? Hmm? Here, I'll include you in an outtake, okay? Okay. Good boy. Down you go.